It starts with an American boy growing up among Christian intellectuals in a Swiss mountain retreat in the 1960s and 70s, daydreaming about one day directing Hollywood films.
I'm a dyslexic little kid roaming around in the Alps, growing up in a weird fundamentalist American evangelical commune.
The boy's name was Frank Schaeffer, and the commune, La Brie, was run by his father, Francis Schaeffer, a Christian philosopher and art historian.
He was a completely off-the-wall, wonderful individual, thinning long hair, was wearing a pair of mountain climbing knickers of the kind that you associate with Swiss mountaineering back in the day.
He had a goatee, but no moustache, almost like a sort of 60s folk singer type look.
Well, it's kind of seems like an odd juxtaposition, but on Sunday morning he'd be preaching from what he called the inerrant word of God. But on Saturday night, the night before, he might be giving a lecture on Bob Dylan's lyrics.
La Brie, which is the French word for shelter, was a stopover for travellers on their way to ashrams or kibbutzim. This was the early 70s, and Francis, unique among evangelical leaders, would lecture on how Christians should engage with modern art or the Woodstock Festival. He attracted some eclectic fans. Eric Clapton visited, and so did Billy Zioli, the man behind a powerhouse Christian film company, Gospel Films.
People were saying to my father, you ought to really do something that takes the lectures you give on the interrelationship of art, culture, and Christianity on film. You should make a documentary. Billy Zioli put together the financing of about a $3.5 million project, which in those days, that was a lot of money for a documentary.
And you got to direct it, even though you were, 19 years old?
Dad was one of these parents who believes in his children's talents.
Frank had grown up in the Alps, idolising directors like Fellini. And while he wasn't especially interested in directing his father's niche Christian art history documentary, he thought maybe he could get a showreel out of it to show Hollywood producers.
At the time, I was looking at this as film school, eventually thinking of going and making what I would have called real movies rather than something for the evangelical market.
Frank embraced the chance to experiment with directorial styles, and the resulting 1976 documentary series, How Should We Then Live, is very ambitious. There are actors in costume and a big travel budget. One minute, Francis is in a Florentine museum.
Anyone who could walk through the museums and not be overwhelmed with the beauty of the work of its art really is a very poor man indeed.
The next, he's on a Paris street, criticising the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre for his moral relativism.
With Sartre's position, one can equally help an old woman across the street.
Merci, monsieur.
Or run her down.
Well, Dad would use examples like that to try to illustrate the fact that without the Word of God, look how bad these guys are. Look what this opens the door to.
But this story about a Christian art historian and his ambitious son is about to take a very strange turn. And all because of an unexpected creative decision Frank made midway through production.
Consider the human fetus, the unborn baby. In January 1973, the United States Supreme Court passed the abortion law.
Francis is talking about Roe v. Wade, which protected a woman's right to an abortion in every US state.
By this Supreme Court ruling, the unborn child is considered not to be a person.
The scene is odd, and not only because it was such a drastic gear shift from the rest of the series. It's mostly odd because Christian evangelicals in the 1970s weren't at all engaged with the issue of abortion. This was coming totally from left field.
Most evangelical Christians saw this as a quote-unquote Catholic issue. And in those days, we had nothing to do with Roman Catholics if we could help it. In fact, Dad's theology would say a Roman Catholic is going to hell.
But now here was the revered Francis Schaeffer, in the spirit of fostering his son's creativity, taking up the abortion issue.
It was my suggestion to my dad that we make the last 2 episodes about abortion